been talking about the topic of Sabbath for about a month now, and how the practice of Sabbath in its original form is a missing element from just about everyone's life outside of maybe Orthodox Jews and certain segments of the Christian population, smaller segments of the Christian population. I've been repeating over the weeks that I believe that the principle of Sabbath, this idea that there is a rhythm of work and rest, is a rhythm that God has actually built into creation. And that here, in our society, our appetite for more, in this culture of consumerism that we live in, our achievement-oriented and comparative lifestyle that we live, has created a system where I think for the most part we've lost this rhythm of life. We work more so that we can consume more. That to me has become the American way of life. Studies show that the number of hours that Americans work has gone up consistently since the 1950s. And I'm going to guess that it's going to just continue to rise until we reach a point that we make the undeniable connection of the damage that it's doing to our bodies and to our souls. I still remember the words of my therapist when he told me that people will change when the pain of not changing becomes greater than the pain of changing. And I've since heard it from other circles, but I heard it from him first. And at some point, I think as a nation, as a people, we're going to get there if we haven't, for many of us already. In the past couple of messages, we've been looking at Sabbath from two different angles, and I think it's important for us to keep these ideas in the forefront of our minds as we continue to build out our understanding of Sabbath, and also a working plan of what that will look like for those of us who want to take part in the practice of Sabbath that some of us will be doing together, starting on the weekend of Friday, March 8th, and lasting for 6 weeks. But again, as I said last week, keep in mind, for those of you that might participate, it doesn't have to be Friday to Saturday. It could be whichever day of the week that you choose. And it doesn't have to be a full day. I think it's perfectly fine to start off with less than an entire day, and the more that I think about this, I'm myself strongly considering that. Now, the two aspects of Sabbath that I want us to keep fresh in our minds is the understanding of Sabbath as menuha, a Hebrew word for rest, a time that we take off to delight in the fruit of our labor, that we enjoy God's goodness, a time when we refresh and replenish and we are restored. But then there is a second aspect of Sabbath that we talked about last week as resistance. That during Sabbath, we're not just passively ceasing from work, but that we're actually resisting the need or the urge or the desire to produce or to achieve or to consume more. We resist that because we need to be reminded that our lives are not defined by what we produce and what we have or acquire. So these are the characteristics of Sabbath that I'll continue to bring up as a way of helping you to keep forming your idea of Sabbath and what that might look like in your life. We learned about these aspects of Sabbath as they are reflected in various Old Testament references, but keep in mind that these are somewhat more recently developed thoughts on Sabbath. The original commandment from God with regards to the Sabbath did not include much in the way of detail or instructions at all. And so this eventually led to Sabbath being observed in ways that was never in line with how God intended or designed Sabbath to work. And we're going to take a look at that as we go along this morning. Because today, I want us to look at what did the coming of Jesus mean to the observance of Sabbath? Did Jesus affect the Sabbath such that it no longer has any authority or validity in our lives as people who are now under the new covenant of God? Did Jesus speak to the issue of Sabbath? He did. We'll look at that. Did Jesus observe Sabbath? We do know that the issue of Sabbath observance was one of the primary sticking points between Jesus and the Jewish religious leaders of his day. He is constantly being accused of breaking the Sabbath throughout the gospel. That issue, along with his choice of dinner companions, the kind of people that he hung out with, and also the Pharisees' sense that he didn't follow their strict dietary guidelines and therefore he was ceremonially impure. These were the areas where they levied the most accusations against him. But keep in mind, these were really just the charges through which they wanted to get him arrested. The real reason they were upset with Jesus and wanted him arrested and ultimately killed is because of who he claimed to be. And of all the charges that they brought against Jesus, the charge of breaking the Sabbath is probably the one that got levied the most. Now, there are numerous instances in the Gospels where Jesus becomes embroiled in Sabbath controversy. And I've looked through most of them, maybe even all of them. But there's one encounter I believe demonstrates the impact of Jesus on the Sabbath for our purposes here. This encounter is actually recorded in all three of the first Gospels, but we're going to read the one that comes from Matthew's version, which is found in chapter 12 of his Gospel. So this is where you'll need your handout. It reads, starting with verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or, haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. All right, a lot going on here. But you have to understand that a lot went on before this confrontation took place with regards to the Sabbath and the evolution that it went through in Israel's society. As we discussed over the past couple of weeks, the idea of Sabbath was first introduced in the account of creation in the opening chapters of the book of Genesis, where it says that God rested after 6 days of work. On the seventh day he rested. It's an example that God set, which we're not actually sure whether the patriarchs followed this example, since it's not mentioned throughout the rest of the account in Genesis. In the Exodus, the actual word and practice of Sabbath comes front and center in the fourth of the 10 Commandments that Moses brings down from Mount Sinai. He would then reiterate this commandment several times, the last of which we looked at last week, was just prior to the Israelites taking ownership of the Promised Land. After that, we know that the understanding of Sabbath began to evolve, and it began to include different things. One man was caught in the book of Numbers. He was out gathering sticks of wood, and this was considered to be work. And it seems harsh, but for this transgression, he was actually put to death. So gathering wood at that time became considered as work, as I'm sure that there were other things that were being identified as work. Because again, you have to remember the command of God that 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. The seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord, and on it you shall not work. This was a very general command. God didn't provide any specifics or details or instructions about how this commandment was to be followed. So if you are endeavoring not to work, well, then you have to identify what work is. What types of activity constitute work? We know, for example, from the Numbers passage that carrying a certain load, like a load of sticks for a fire, was considered to be work. But now you have to define, well, what constitutes a load? What types of things can you pick up and not pick up? And if you can pick up something, well, when have you picked up too much? One thing we know is that the Israelites did not follow and observe this commandment in the spirit and in the ways that God intended them to. And we know this because the prophet Jeremiah prophesied to the southern kingdom of Judah, warning them specifically with regards to observing the Sabbath just prior to their destruction at the hands of the Babylonians. This is what Jeremiah said to them. He said, "This is what the Lord says. Be careful not to carry a load on the Sabbath day, or bring it through the gates of Jerusalem. Do not bring a load out of your houses, or do any work on the Sabbath, but keep the Sabbath day holy, as I commanded your ancestors." Yet they did not listen or pay attention. They were stiff-necked and would not listen or respond to discipline. "But if you are careful to obey me, declares the Lord, and bring no load through the gates of this city on the Sabbath, but keep the Sabbath day holy by not doing any work on it, then kings who sit on David's throne will come through the gates of this city with their officials. They and their officials will come riding in chariots and on horses, accompanied by the men of Judah and those living in Jerusalem. And this city will be inhabited forever. But if you do not obey me to keep the Sabbath day holy by not carrying any load as you come through the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle an unquenchable fire in the gates of Jerusalem that will consume her fortresses." So, God's favor upon the southern kingdom of Judah is tied to their observance of Sabbath, which ultimately they did not keep. And they subsequently were defeated by the Babylonians. The temple was leveled, it was utterly destroyed, and all the people were deported. And while they were living as exiles, the prophet Ezekiel spoke words of judgment to them, reminding the Israelites in captivity how they had broken God's laws over the course of their entire history. And he would specifically bring up the breaking of the Sabbath numerous times in Ezekiel chapter 20. Later in their history, when the Jewish captives returned from Babylon, and they were restored to their former lands, and this happened several centuries before the time of Christ, they knew from the messages of Jeremiah and Ezekiel that their nation had been destroyed for breaking God's laws. And violating the Sabbath was one of their chief sins. So once they were restored to the land, they determined never to make the same mistake again. Consequently, over several centuries, Jewish religious authorities crafted meticulous regulations detailing exactly what they considered permissible and impermissible with regards to the law in general, but also with regards to the Sabbath in particular. These regulations became part of what was known as the oral law. They were separate and distinct from the written law, which was the Torah, the first 5 books that we have in our Bibles. They were human interpretations of what the law was and how to live according to the law. And yet, by the time of Jesus, they were actually given authoritative status by many of the Jewish leaders of his day. Now, there were 39 principal classes of prohibited actions on the Sabbath, ranging from plowing to sowing to reaping and gathering, threshing, winnowing, cleansing, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, and that's just some of them. But then each of these categories were further broken down and discussed and elaborated on so that there were actually hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things that a conscientious, law-abiding Jew could not do on the Sabbath. For example, you couldn't walk more than 3,000 feet, which back in that day was the equivalent of 1,999 steps. So if you took your 2,000th step, well, you just broke the Sabbath. Tying a knot could be deemed working back in those days. But then not all knots were seen as work, so it was determined that you could only tie knots that you can untie with one hand. If you had to use two hands to untie the knot, well, you worked in tying that knot and you broke the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, you could only write 2 letters. And I'm not talking about like letters that you would write to someone and send it to them. We're talking about 2 letters of the alphabet. You can only write 2 letters. If you wrote a 3rd letter, you broke the Sabbath. Now, it's easy for us to understand that something like plowing would be considered work based on our understanding of plowing, but their definitions get rather ridiculous. If you spit on the ground, that could be considered work because your spit disturbed the soil and you might have plowed. If you moved a chair outside of your house and in the process you happened to drag one of the legs on the ground and it left a rut in the ground, in the soil, well, you just plowed. And you broke the Sabbath. As I mentioned earlier, you were forbidden to carry a burden, but again, a burden had to be defined. And so it was. The scribal laws indicate that a burden is, and I'm quoting here, food equal in weight to a dried fig. Don't carry more than a dried fig. Or wine enough for mixing in a goblet. Or milk enough for one swallow. Or, depends on how big your mouth is, I guess, right? Or honey enough that you could just put on one wound. And it was just, so on and so on and so on. So you better be careful what you carry if you decide to walk at all. And even if you did walk without anything, you better be careful where you walk, because walking on grass was forbidden due to the fact that by walking on the grass, some of the blades would end up getting bent and broken, and that's constituting threshing according to them. And so you would break the law if you walked on grass. The restrictions on the Sabbath were just incredibly overbearing. And I bring all of this up so that you understand the context of Jesus' encounter and the hypercritical religious atmosphere of that time. In the passage from the Gospel of Matthew, the Pharisees witnessed that as Jesus and his disciples are walking through a field of grain, the disciples begin to pluck some of the heads of grain and eat them because they were hungry. Luke's account of this same encounter in chapter 6 of his gospel gives us a little bit more detail about what the disciples were doing. It says that as they were going through the grain fields, his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Again, they did this because they were hungry, not because they were out harvesting that field. And the reality is, their actions were perfectly acceptable according to the written laws of God that he provided to the nation of Israel. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 23, God made a specific allowance that people are allowed to pick handfuls of grain as they walk through another individual's property as a form of sustenance, as long as they don't take a sickle out and start taking more than they actually need. God even commands landowners in the book of Leviticus to leave portions of their fields unharvested so that the poor and those who are traveling would be able to glean off the edges and have something to eat. The disciples were walking through the field, and as they walked, they were picking off heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands to remove the chaff, and then eating the kernels. This required almost no effort on their part, and it could hardly be construed as work. And yet, as we've been discussing, the Pharisees invoked their oral traditions and rules that they themselves had created and which viewed the disciples' actions as a form of reaping and reaping and threshing, which again were among two of the 39 categories of work that was forbidden. So although these actions did not violate God's written command about Sabbath, they did violate the Pharisees man-made oral regulations about how the Sabbath should be kept. And so they therefore criticized his disciples for it. Jesus' defense has several layers within the same stories. On one level, the story of King David involves this well-known event from his life where he was on the run from King Saul's armies, and he and his men were famished, near the point of starvation, and had nothing to eat. They arrived at a town called Nob, which was a city about an hour north of Jerusalem, and was known during that time because Saul had the tabernacle. The tabernacle was this large tent structure that was used in the same function as the temple would be used when they were wandering out in the desert. Saul had that structure stored in this town, so there were priests that were there. David and his men were on the run, and they're famished, and they have no food. And nothing was available except the consecrated bread that was only to be eaten by the priests. I mean, you could eat it, but then you'd be killed, so what good would it do? However, the priest, in this moment of need, offered the bread to David, and he took it, and he gave it to his men, and history has deemed David to be guiltless in his sight. And the Pharisees know that. The point that Jesus is making is that certain things are sanctified, and they're set apart by God. The bread is consecrated, and that's set apart by God. The Sabbath is consecrated, it's holy, and it's set apart by God. But these were instituted as a means of teaching the Israelites about holiness and about sanctification and God's way of living. They were not meant to be inflexible, rigid rules, and the intention was not to cause hardship and suffering. When David's life and the life of his men were at stake, and when the man with the withered hand was approached in the synagogue, and Jesus knew that he was being scrutinized and that his work of healing this man would be yet again another violation of Sabbath, he purposely healed the man, and in both instances he is declaring to the Pharisees that when it comes to human need and suffering, mercy triumphs over law. In Mark's gospel account of this confrontation, Jesus says to the Pharisees that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. If the Sabbath was made for man's benefit and not man for the benefit of the Sabbath, then when a particular Sabbath posed hardship on an individual, then it can legitimately, for the sake of mercy, be set aside. In all of these examples, the original spirit and intent of the law were not broken, including the priests who are serving at the temple on Sabbath and whom even the Pharisees understood was necessary for the religious communal and religious life of the people. But in all of these instances, these things were allowed on Sabbath for the sake of mercy and for the greater good of the people. You see, Jesus was coming against the Pharisees' man-made, systematized rules that had turned the Sabbath day into a time of hardship and legalism weighted down with hundreds and hundreds of rules and regulations. God designed the Sabbath day to be a blessing, a time of genuine rest from our work, a time for menuha. It was not meant to be an unmanageable, overly restrictive burden. It was a time for it to be enjoyed and not a time to be endured. I believe that Jesus brought back the spirit of the original intention of the Sabbath as he really did the entire law. You can see that in his whole Sermon on the Mount. He's bringing back the spirit underlying the law. He wanted to free people from the striving that was brought on by the endless rules and statutes of the Pharisaical tradition, which I think is captured so well in his famous Matthew chapter 11 statement, where he says to his listeners, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." I actually like Eugene Peterson's translation of this message. In the of this passage in the Message, where it reads, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." I think Jesus spoke these words specifically with the yoke of the oral tradition of the Pharisees and the religious leaders in mind, and how their yoke, their added rules and regulations had weighed people down and taken them away from the grace and the freedom and the goodness that God had intended to provide the Israelites through his prescription for life that he handed down to Moses. Which is why I think it's important for us to not become too legalistic in the ways in which we observe Sabbath as well. As we've been discussing, I believe the principle behind Sabbath is one of rest and delight and enjoyment and connection with God, as well as a disconnection from certain things in our culture that we need to take a break from so that we can rest. But even during our times of Sabbath, there could be times when a work of mercy is needed, or an opportunity to do good presents itself. And the legalistic following of Sabbath should never keep us from doing those kinds of things. Now, did Jesus Sabbath? Most scholars will say, although it's not explicitly indicated in the Gospels, they will say that he almost certainly did. The fact that many of his confrontations with the religious leaders that you'll find recorded in the Gospels took place on the grounds of the synagogue or at the temple on Sabbath is an indication that Jesus was at those locations in order to observe Sabbath. Now, I don't think the issue is whether Jesus observed Sabbath, but maybe more so how he observed Sabbath. I get the sense, as I read through it, that Jesus was committed to observe Sabbath in the way in which it was intended to be experienced, and that this likely meant that he felt free to transgress any of the oral rules regarding the Sabbath if they violated the spirit or the intended purpose of the Sabbath. So, having said that, let me close on a different note, because, as I mentioned, there is a layer deeper than what we've been talking about in this confrontation that took place in the Matthew passage between Jesus and the Pharisees. And I'd be remiss if I didn't at least go over it. Scholars say that Jesus intentionally mentioned David's situation because he knew that the Pharisees could very well feel that David had transgressed the law and no amount of mercy could actually justify his eating the bread. So Jesus' argument may not have held water for them. That's how strict they were over the observance of their traditions. But he also knew that none of the Pharisees would ever accuse or indict David over the issue, this particular issue, because of who David was. David was the future king. He was, in the eyes of the entire Jewish nation, the anointed one. And because of who he was, it was believed that the law could temporarily be suspended for him. In the case of the priests of the temple, who labored on the Sabbath for obvious reasons, their work, in the eyes of the Pharisees and religious leaders, was also suspended from violating the Sabbath, but not because of the greatness of the priests, no, it was because of the greatness of the temple, the greatness of the cause, or the work in which they were engaged. No Jew needed to be convinced of the greatness of the temple, and thus temple service was a readily accepted justification for the priests working on the Sabbath. They were exempt from non-observance, again, because of the greatness of the temple. Jesus brings these specific things up, and then he throws a bombshell. he tells them, and it's literally there, but it's also intuitively there in his words. He essentially tells them, someone greater than David is here. Someone greater than the temple is in your presence. And he then finishes off this particular encounter by saying that the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. This is yet another shocking claim to the truth of his identity. Jesus lets them know that he is no mere equal to David or the temple, and if the law could be suspended because of the greatness of David or because of the greatness of the temple, Jesus' claim is not just that the requirements of the law could be suspended for him as well. He claims to have the freedom and the authority to set it aside altogether if he pleases. He is the Lord of the Sabbath, a claim that only God could make. And it's this claim, or claims like this, that he makes that enraged the religious leaders. And this was the reason why they began to make plans about how they could ultimately get rid of him. Okay, so those are just some of my thoughts on Jesus and the Sabbath. Next week we're going to look at solitude. Because as I've been walking through this, I feel like solitude is an integral part of Sabbath. Doesn't mean that we spend time in solitude the entire time, but I think it's an important part of learning to be with God. And so we're going to look at that, because I think that is going to be a struggle for some of us, including myself. Okay, let's pray. Lord, as we continue to move through this material on Sabbath, I sense so much that we have added, and I say we, I don't just mean Pharisees, I think we have added so much to our life with you, so many rules and man-made regulations, Lord, that we've often lost the spirit of what life with you is meant to be like. I think our journey into this Sabbath time can be helpful, Lord, in ways of helping us to experience what life with you is meant to be like. To be able to set aside some time, Lord, to get away from the world, to get away from all the influences, Lord, that for so long have normalized what we tend to think is the spiritual life, but in a lot of ways I don't think it is. So I'm excited, Lord. I'm also I have a little bit of trepidation about the time, because I think we do need to think it through, Lord, because we've lived so long in this culture, Father, that I think we've forgotten what Sabbath means. So help us to help one another, Lord, and to begin to set aside time, Lord, and to share with one another, because I think, Lord, it's meant to be a communal time. It's meant to be a time that we go through together, Lord. And so I'm thankful for our time today, being able to spend time looking at your word and at the remarkable things in the encounter that you had with the Pharisees. I ask that you would just bless our time of worship and prayer and communion now. We thank you, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.